Laughter echoed through the local diner every single time Tobias walked through the doors. They called him the Fool of Windham County, a stubborn man clinging to 40 acres of dead dirt. But all mockery violently stopped the morning one twisted, forgotten sapling bled gold, making him a millionaire by midnight. The stench of vinegar and decay hung heavy over Oakhaven orchards. Tobias Miller stood at the crest of the eastern ridge, his worn boots sinking into soil that felt more like powdered ash than fertile dirt. Around him stretched 40 acres of his family's legacy, now reduced to a sprawling graveyard of brittle, leafless trees. It was mid-July, a time when the region's famous honey-crisp apples should have been swelling with heavy, green promise. Instead, the branches were skeletal, reaching up toward the scorching sun like desperate, grasping fingers. The orchard was dying and taking Tobias's sanity right along with it. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dark grease across his brow. His grandfather, Ezekiel Miller, had spent half a century building this farm into the crown jewel of the valley. But when Ezekiel passed away 3 years ago, something in the soil seemed to die with him. Despite Tobias working grueling 80-hour weeks, pouring thousands of dollars into experimental fertilizers, soil aeration, and emergency irrigation, the rot continued to spread. It was an aggressive, unidentifiable blight that baffled the county agricultural inspectors. They told him to burn the trees and sell the land, and they weren't the only ones. The heavy crunch of expensive tires on the gravel driveway pulled Tobias from his grim thoughts. He looked down the hill to see a sleek black SUV rolling to a stop near his dilapidated farmhouse. The driver's side door opened, and Gregory Finch stepped out, adjusting a perfectly tailored suit jacket that had no business being worn on a farm. Finch owned Finch Agricultural, a massive corporate farming conglomerate that had been swallowing up independent farms across the county for a decade. It was a shark operating on dry land, and Tobias was bleeding profusely into the water. Tobias took a deep breath, steeling himself, and marched down the hill. "I thought I told you not to come back here, Gregory," Tobias said as he approached, his voice rough from exhaustion and lack of water. Finch offered a smile that didn't reach his cold, grey eyes. "Good morning to you too, Tobias. I was just passing by, taking a look at this tragedy. It really breaks my heart to see Ezekiel's pride and joy looking like a dried-up riverbed." "Cut the act," Tobias spat, stopping a few feet away. "What do you want?" Finch sighed, pulling a folded envelope from his inner pocket. "I'm here to throw you a lifeline. Samuel Croft, over at First National Bank, is a good friend of mine. We had a little chat at the country club yesterday. He mentioned you missed your 3rd consecutive mortgage payment. Foreclosure notices go out at the end of the month." Tobias felt a cold spike of panic in his chest, but he kept his face stone still. "That's between me and the bank. Not anymore," Finch countered, tapping the envelope against his palm. "I am prepared to offer you cash for the deed. $300 an acre. It's enough to clear your debt with Croft and walk away with a few thousand in your pocket to start over somewhere else. Somewhere that isn't cursed." Tobias clenched his fists. 300 an acre was an insulting joke. The land, even barren, was worth 10 times that. But Finch knew Tobias was trapped. Finch didn't want to farm the land. He wanted to bulldoze it, pave it over, and build a massive distribution warehouse right on the highway junction. "Get off my property," Tobias growled, taking a threatening step forward. "I'm not selling my grandfather's land, so you can turn it into a concrete parking lot." Finch's artificial smile finally dropped, revealing the ruthless businessman underneath. "You're a fool, Miller. You're drowning in debt, your trees are dead, and the whole town is laughing at you. By this time next month, the bank will seize this land, and I'll buy it at auction for half of what I'm offering you right now. Take the money." "Leave!" Tobias roared, pointing a trembling finger toward the highway. Finch scoffed, tossing the envelope onto the hood of Tobias's rusted pickup truck. "The offer expires on Friday. I'd start packing." He climbed back into his SUV and sped off, kicking up a cloud of grey, lifeless dust. Later that evening, Tobias sat in a corner booth at the Rusty Spoon, the local diner where the town's agricultural gossip flowed faster than the coffee. He kept his head down, staring into a mug of lukewarm black coffee, but he could feel the eyes on him. A few booths over, a group of local farmers were laughing loudly. "I drove by Miller's Folly today," booming voice echoed. It belonged to Harrison Gable, a man who had sold his own farm to Finch years ago and now managed a corporate fleet. "I swear, the crows don't even land on his trees anymore. They know there's nothing left to scavenge." More laughter erupted. Brenda, the diner's longtime waitress, walked over and wordlessly refilled Tobias's mug, offering him a sympathetic, pitying look that somehow hurt worse than the mockery. "Don't listen to them, Toby," she whispered. "They're just bitter." "They're right, Brenda," Tobias muttered, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "The farm is dead. I've tried everything. The soil pH is perfect, the water table is clean, but the roots are just rotting in the ground. It makes no sense." He left the diner with a burning pit of despair in his stomach. When he returned to the farmhouse, he went straight to his grandfather's old study. The room was perfectly preserved, lined with dusty agricultural journals and maps. Ezekiel Miller had been an eccentric man, obsessed with heirloom seeds and ancient grafting techniques. Tobias pulled open the bottom drawer of the heavy oak desk and took out Ezekiel's final leather-bound journal. He had read it 100 times, searching for an answer. The final entries were frantic, written just weeks before Ezekiel's heart gave out. "The soil here is tired," Ezekiel had written. "The commercial chemicals, the pesticides. We stripped the soul from the earth. But there is a cure. The cutting from the Caucasus. The mother root. I planted it at the exact center of the grid. It must survive. If it takes hold, it will purge the rot." Tobias slammed the journal shut. He knew exactly what tree Ezekiel was talking about. Right in the middle of the dying orchard sat the strangest, ugliest sapling Tobias had ever seen. Ezekiel had smuggled a cutting back from a trip to Eastern Europe a decade ago. For years it had remained a stunted, twisted little stump, producing strange, ash-colored bark and absolutely zero leaves. Tobias had ignored it, viewing it as just another one of his grandfather's crazy failed experiments. Now, it was the only thing standing between him and total ruin. And looking out the window at the desolate, moonlit orchard, Tobias decided he was done waiting for a miracle. He was going to cut the ugly thing down, clear the center acre, and try one last desperate crop of winter wheat. The air was suffocatingly humid when Tobias marched out into the orchard at 11 p.m., a heavy steel felling axe resting on his shoulder. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a summer storm that refused to break. Dry lightning flickered on the horizon, briefly illuminating the skeletons of the dead apple trees around him. He navigated the rows by memory until he reached the dead center of the property. There it was. The mother root, as Ezekiel had called it. It looked worse than ever. The trunk, about as thick as a man's thigh, was twisted like a wrung-out rag. Its bark was charcoal black and rough, covered in strange, knotty burls. There were no branches, just 3 jagged wooden spikes jutting toward the sky. It looked like a monument to failure. "You're the reason," Tobias muttered to the tree, his voice shaking with a potent mix of grief and rage. "He spent his last months fussing over you instead of saving the cash crop. You killed this farm." He gripped the handle of the axe with both hands, raised it high above his head, and brought it down with all the remaining strength in his exhausted body. Clang! The impact sent a violent, bone-rattling shock-wave up Tobias's arms. The axe rebounded so hard it nearly flew out of his hands. Tobias stumbled backward, gasping in shock. He looked at the blade of his heavy steel axe. It was chipped. He stared at the twisted trunk. There wasn't even a dent in the wood. Instead, at the exact point of impact, a thick, iridescent sap began to bead on the bark. It didn't look like tree sap. It glowed with a faint, bioluminescent silver light, slowly dripping down the blackened wood like liquid mercury. Suddenly, the suffocating pressure in the air broke. A massive crack of thunder shook the ground beneath his feet, and the sky opened up. But it wasn't rain that fell. It was a bizarre, localized deluge of heavy, freezing mist. Tobias dropped the axe and backed away as the silver sap began to spread, coating the entire trunk. The ground around the tree's roots began to hiss, the grey, dead soil turning rich and dark as the glowing sap dripped into the earth. Panicked and exhausted, Tobias turned and ran back to the farmhouse. He locked the door, stripped off his damp clothes, and collapsed into his bed, convinced that stress and debt had finally pushed him into full-blown hallucinations. When he woke up, the digital clock on his nightstand read 6 a.m. The first thing Tobias noticed was the smell. It was overwhelming. It seeped through the cracks in the old window frames, a scent so intoxicating it made his mouth water instantly. It smelled like spun sugar, wild vanilla, and something sharp and electric, like the air right after a lightning strike. He threw on a pair of jeans and rushed out onto the front porch, stopping dead in his tracks. The grey, chalky soil that had plagued the orchard for 3 years was gone. In its place was dark, loamy earth, rich with moisture. But that wasn't what paralyzed Tobias. In the center of the orchard, towering over the dead husks of the apple trees, stood a magnificent giant. The stunted, ugly trunk had erupted overnight. It was now 30 feet tall, its canopy spreading wound and thick. The leaves were a deep, mesmerizing emerald green, shimmering slightly in the early morning light, and hanging from the branches were the fruits. Tobias stumbled off the porch and sprinted through the rows, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he reached the base of the tree, he fell to his knees. The tree was heavily laden with fruit the size of large pomegranates, but their skin was smooth and midnight blue, speckled with tiny flecks of gold that caught the sunlight. Hesitantly, Tobias reached up and plucked one from a low-hanging branch. It felt heavy in his hand, warm to the touch. The skin gave way easily beneath his thumb, revealing flesh that looked like shimmering, golden honey. He brought it to his lips and took a bite. The flavor was indescribable. It was an explosion of perfectly aged wine, crisp, tart apple, and a rich, buttery sweetness that instantly dissolved on his tongue. But it wasn't just the taste. The moment he swallowed, a rush of pure, unadulterated energy surged through his veins. The chronic, dull ache in his lower back, a pain he had lived with for a decade, vanished completely. The exhaustion behind his eyes was wiped away, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. "What are you?" Tobias whispered in awe, staring up into the glowing canopy. He didn't know what this fruit was, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Gregory Finch was not getting this farm. Not for 300 an acre. Not for 3 million. Tobias wasn't the only one who noticed the miracle, however. On the western ridge, peering through a pair of high-powered binoculars, laid a man named Brody. How was Finch's chief farmhand, paid off the books to keep an eye on the struggling Miller property and report back on Tobias's misery. Brody lowered the binoculars, his jaw hanging slack. He had seen the strange glowing light through the storm last night, and now he was looking at an impossible, massive tree that hadn't been there yesterday. Pulling a cell phone from his pocket, Brody dialed his boss's number. "Finch," Brody said, his voice trembling as he watched Tobias eat the golden flesh of the blue fruit. "You need to get down here right now. Something insane just happened at the Miller place, and I think you're going to want to steal it." The phone call from Brody sent Gregory Finch into an immediate, ruthless frenzy. Sitting in his immaculate, glass-walled office overlooking the valley, Finch listened to his spy's frantic description of the overnight miracle at Oak Haven Orchards. At first, Finch dismissed it as the exaggerated ramblings of an uneducated farmhand. Trees did not sprout 30 feet in a matter of hours, and they certainly did not bear midnight blue fruit glowing with golden flecks. But when Brody sent a blurred, zoomed-in photograph from his phone, Finch's cold skepticism evaporated into a sharp, predatory hunger. He did not know what anomalous botanical mutation had occurred on Tobias Miller's land, but he knew its proprietary value could be astronomical. Finch slammed his phone down and immediately dialed Samuel Croft at First National Bank. He needed to expedite the foreclosure. If Tobias had somehow managed to cultivate a hyper-valuable cash crop, the window to steal the property for pennies was rapidly closing. Croft, a cowardly banker perpetually intimidated by Finch's wealth, agreed to draft an emergency notice of seizure based on a technicality in the loan's insurance clauses. Finch grabbed his coat, ordered his private security team to mobilize, and sped toward the dying farm. Meanwhile, Tobias was not waiting around for the vultures to descend. He knew the sudden appearance of the miraculous tree would not remain a secret in a town that thrived on gossip. Working with feverish intensity, he carefully harvested a dozen of the heavy blue fruits, placing them gently into a wooden crate lined with soft straw. The physical effects of eating just one fruit were still coursing through his body. His joints, usually screaming in agony by mid-morning, felt perfectly lubricated. His mind was incredibly sharp, processing information with a clarity he had not experienced since his 20s. Tobias loaded the crate into the passenger seat of his rusted pickup truck and threw a heavy tarp over it. He bypassed the local agricultural inspectors, knowing they were all deep in Finch's pockets, and drove 3 hours straight to the State Botanical Research Institute in the city. He needed someone impartial, someone whose loyalty belonged entirely to science. He needed Dr. Maxwell Trenton. Dr. Trenton was a renowned agricultural biochemist whom Ezekiel Miller used to correspond with years ago when Tobias carried the crate into Trenton's sterile, brightly lit laboratory The older scientist was initially dismissive. The moment Tobias pulled back the tarp, the sharp, intoxicating scent of wild vanilla and electric sweetness flooded the laboratory. Dr. Trenton's eyes widened behind his thick spectacles. He picked up of the fruits, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the smooth, sapphire skin and the golden speckles that seemed to catch and trap the fluorescent overhead lights. "This is impossible," Dr. Trenton whispered, rushing to his stainless steel workbench. He sliced a small wedge of the fruit, revealing the shimmering, honey-like flesh, and placed it under a high-powered electron microscope. For the next 4 hours, Tobias paced the hallway while the scientist ran mass spectrometry tests, cellular decomposition analyses, and nutritional profiling. When Dr. Trenton finally emerged, his face was pale and his lab coat was rumpled. He held a stack of printouts in his shaking hands. "Tobias, what exactly did your grandfather plant out there?" "He called it the mother root," Tobias replied, his heart pounding against his ribs. "A cutting from the Caucasus, that's all I know. What did you find?" Dr. Trenton adjusted his glasses, looking at the papers as if they contained magic spells. "The cellular structure of this fruit defies standard botany. It contains a uniquely synthesized compound, a highly concentrated antioxidant matrix that aggressive repairs cellular degradation. In layman's terms, it rapidly accelerates cell regeneration. The nutritional density is off the charts. Pharmaceutical companies would pay billions just to sequence its genome. High-end culinary markets would start bidding wars for a single crate. Tobias, you do not just have a rare apple, you have a botanical gold mine." Tobias felt the air leave his lungs. "How much is one fruit worth?" "If I publish these preliminary findings," Dr. Trenton said, his voice dropping to a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, "you could easily command $10,000 per fruit from elite wellness and culinary buyers. But you must be incredibly careful. If word of this reaches the agricultural conglomerates before you secure the intellectual property rights, they will destroy you to get their hands on it." Tobias thanked the scientist, took the remaining fruits, and drove back to Windham County with a fire in his chest. He was no longer the town fool holding on to dead dirt. He was a king returning to his castle, to his schools. But when he finally turned down the gravel driveway of Oakhaven Orchards as the sun began to set, he found his castle under siege. 3 black SUVs were parked horizontally across his property line, blocking the entrance. Gregory Finch stood leaning against the hood of the lead vehicle, flanked by 4 imposing private security contractors and a very nervous-looking Samuel Croft, who clutched a leather briefcase to his chest. Tobias slammed on the brakes, the rusted truck skidding to a halt just inches from Finch's SUV. He stepped out, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, unshakable confidence. "You're trespassing, Gregory," Tobias stated, his voice echoing in the quiet twilight. Finch smiled, though his eyes darted nervously toward the center of the orchard, trying to catch a glimpse of the glowing tree. "Not any more, Miller. Samuel here has discovered a breach in your agricultural insurance policy. Your land is no longer compliant with commercial farming regulations, which triggers an immediate default on your mortgage. We are here to serve the eviction notice. The bank is seizing the property effectively immediately, and I am purchasing the deed." Croft stepped forward, his hands shaking as he held out a thick stack of legal documents. "I'm sorry, Tobias. The board demanded immediate action." Tobias didn't even look at the papers. He looked right through the banker, fixing his gaze on Finch. "You brought private muscle to serve a bank notice? You're terrified, Gregory. You saw what grew in my orchard, and you know it's worth more than your entire miserable corporate empire." Finch's smile vanished. "Seize the property," he barked at the security men. "Remove him from the premises. If he resists, call the local deputies." The security contractors stepped forward, their hands resting menacingly on their utility belts. But before they could close the distance, the heavy wail of a police siren shattered the evening silence. A wind-battered local cruiser tore up the gravel road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust before sliding sideways to block Finch's SUVs from behind. Sheriff Donovan Hayes stepped out of the cruiser. He was a massive, uncompromising man who had known Tobias's grandfather for decades and despised Finch's predatory business tactics. He rested his hand on his holstered sidearm and glared at the corporate intruders. "Evening, gentlemen," Sheriff Hayes boomed. "I received a call from a Dr. Trenton at the State University. He advised me that Mr. Miller here is in possession of highly valuable, unpatented intellectual property, and that certain corporate entities might try to utilize illegal intimidation tactics to acquire it. Looks like the good doctor was right." Finch's face twisted in rage. "This is a lawful foreclosure, Hayes. Stay out of it." "Actually," Tobias interrupted, walking calmly to the passenger side of his truck. He reached under the tarp and pulled out a heavy canvas bank bag he had acquired in the city. He walked over to the trembling banker and tossed the bag directly into Croft's chest. The banker stumbled backward, clutching the heavy canvas. "What is this?" Croft stammered. "That is $250,000 in certified cashier's checks," Tobias said coldly. "I stopped by a private agricultural investment firm in the city on my way back. I sold the exclusive rights to the first harvest of 50 fruits to Winston Carmichael, the wellness billionaire. He wired the advance directly to my new accounts. That bag covers my entire mortgage, all the back interest, and the penalty fees. My debt is cleared. First National Bank no longer has any claim to Oakhaven Orchards." Croft unzipped the bag, his eyes bulging as he saw the stack of certified documents. He looked at Finch, terrified. "Mr. Finch, the debt is satisfied. We have no legal standing here." Finch's face turned an ugly shade of violet. He lunged forward, grabbing Croft by the collar of his expensive suit. "You spineless idiot! You said the paperwork was airtight." "Let him go, Gregory," Sheriff Hayes warned, stepping forward and unsnapping his holster. "The debt is paid. This is now private property. If you and your men aren't off this land in 30 seconds, I'm arresting you for criminal trespass and attempted corporate espionage." Finch shoved the banker away, his breathing heavy and ragged. He stared at Tobias, sheer hate radiating from his cold grey eyes. "This isn't over, Miller. You're one man with one tree. I will bury you in litigation. I will tie that tree up in court until it rots." "You can try," Tobias said, a slight smile finally touching his lips. "But my new business partner, Mr. Carmichael, retains the most aggressive corporate law firm in the state. If you even look at my property line, Evelyn Pierce will sue your conglomerate into absolute bankruptcy. Now, get off my farm." Defeated and humiliated, Finch climbed back into his SUV. The security contractors quickly followed, and the convoy reversed awkwardly down the driveway, speeding away into the gathering darkness. Tobias stood with the sheriff, watching them go. A profound, heavy silence fell over the farm, but for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't the silence of death. It was the peaceful quiet of a hard-won victory. Over the next 6 months, Oakhaven orchards transformed completely. The bizarre, glowing sap from the mother root had not just healed the strange sapling, it had seeped into the underground water table. The silver luminescence had purged the mysterious blight from the soil. By the following spring, the skeletal apple trees that everyone had mocked began to blossom with aggressive, vibrant life. The honey-crisp apples returned, larger and sweeter than Ezekiel Miller had ever managed to grow them. But the true crown jewel remained the towering giant in the center of the property. Tobias heavily fortified the center acre, installing state-of-the-art security systems and a climate-controlled greenhouse structure around the mother root. He meticulously harvested the midnight blue fruit, selling them exclusively through Winston Carmichael's distribution network. The scientific community eventually dubbed the fruit Malus equus, but the locals just called it Miller's Gold. The incredible influx of capital allowed Tobias to completely rebuild the farm. He hired a dedicated staff, repaired the dilapidated farmhouse, and bought cutting-edge farming equipment. He even bought the adjoining 200 acres, land that Finch was forced to sell off to avoid bankruptcy after Carmichael's lawyers launched a devastating countersuit for predatory business practices. One crisp autumn morning, a year after the miracle, Tobias walked into the Rusty Spoon diner. The bell above the door jingled, and the usual morning chatter instantly died down. The local farmers who used to laugh at him now stared in awed, respectful silence. Harrison Gable, the loudmouth who had relentlessly mocked Tobias's dying trees, sheepishly looked down at his plate of eggs, unable to make eye contact. Brenda, the waitress who had always shown him kindness, beamed brightly from behind the counter. "Morning, Toby. The usual black coffee?" "Actually, Brenda," Tobias smiled, sliding into his old corner booth, "I think I'll have the full breakfast today. Steak and eggs. And put everyone else's tab on my bill. We're celebrating a good harvest." He looked out the diner window, past the highway, toward the eastern ridge where Oakhaven Orchard stood proud and green against the horizon. The town fool had become the undisputed king of Windham County, all because he refused to give up on a rotting legacy, and because he dared to trust the strange, twisted roots of the past. Talk about the ultimate payback. Tobias went from being the town laughingstock to a multimillionaire, saving his family's legacy while completely destroying Finch's greedy empire. Nature truly has a mysterious way of rewarding those who refuse to give up. What would you have done if you found a glowing tree in your backyard? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible real-life storytelling. See you next time.